Sewn onto the chest of a man's robe, in threads of pale silk, there is a single embroidered crane. Just a bird. Wings half lifted, neck curved, standing on one thin leg among stitched clouds. And everyone who sees it knows, without a word being spoken, exactly how low to bow. That small square of cloth, no wider than your open hand, carries more meaning than the man's face, his name, or anything he might say. It tells the whole world where he stands in an order that stretches from the frozen edge of a northern wall all the way to a throne no ordinary person would ever be allowed to see. Tonight we are going to climb that order, slowly, one gentle step at a time. Welcome to Late Night Calm. Let the room go soft around you. Let the weight of the day loosen its hold on your shoulders, finger by finger, until there is nothing left in your hands to carry. Tonight we are going to walk up a very old staircase, from the lowest courtyard to the highest hall, through a world that lasted more than 2,000 years, the world of Imperial China. We will meet the servant seized for labour, the farmer bent over his grain, the merchant rich in coin and poor in respect, the scholar who passed a single test and changed his family forever, the official with his embroidered bird, the eunuch who whispered in an emperor's ear, and at the very top, the man they called the Son of Heaven. You do not have to remember any of it. You do not have to follow closely, or keep track of where we are on the stairs. If you drift off between one step and the next, that is perfectly fine. The staircase will keep going without you, patient as ever, and you will simply be somewhere warmer and higher when you wake. If these quiet journeys bring you a little calm, you are welcome to like or subscribe or leave a soft word in the comments below. It helps others who lie awake at night find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, none of that matters. For now, let your breathing slow, let your jaw come unclenched, let the bed hold you completely. And let's begin, at the very bottom of the world we're about to climb. Picture a walled courtyard, somewhere deep inside a great palace, long before the sun. The air is cold and still. Nothing moves yet but the breath of the girls sleeping crowded together on hard beds, and somewhere out in the dark, the slow, measured tolling of a bell. In this world, time is not kept by clocks the way you might know them. It is kept by bells and by watches, the night divided into long stretches, each one marked by a sound that carries across the tiled roofs. And when that bell sounds before dawn, the girls rise. This is the life of the palace maid, the one the old records call the gone, and she sits at the very bottom of everything we are going to see tonight. She did not choose this. Almost none of them did. Across the long centuries of empire, and especially in the last two great dynasties, the Ming and the Qing, the court would send out a call, a draft, a summons, and from ordinary households across the land, girls would be gathered up and brought to the capital. Many of them were only around 13 years old. Think of that for a moment, gently, without letting it wake you. A child of 13, taken from her family, brought to a place she had never seen, to be looked over like something at a market. They inspected the girls for their health, their height, the smoothness of their skin, the sound of their voices, the way they carried themselves. Some were kept for service inside the palace walls. Others were sent home again. And the girl herself had almost nothing to say about which door she walked through. Under the Qing, the dynasty of the Manchu rulers, this was made into a careful system with a name, the Xian, the draft of maidens. The daughters of the banner families, the households tied to the ruling armies, were written down in registers, and they were not free to simply marry whom they liked and when they liked. First, they had to wait. First, the court had to look them over and decide. From that pool of registered daughters, the emperor's household chose its consorts, the women who might one day share the throne's shadow, and it chose its servants, the women who would spend their days sweeping and carrying and kneeling. One girl might rise, in the wildest turn of fortune, toward the emperor himself. Another, standing right beside her in the same inspection, might spend the next years of her youth hauling water across a frozen courtyard. The same door, two entirely different lives. And what was that life for the one who became a maid? It was labour, graded and endless. There was a strict order even among the servants, matrons above, senior maids above the junior ones, everyone with someone to answer to and someone to command. The lowest girls swept the courtyards and the long stone corridors. They did the laundry, their hands raw in cold water. They carried water from well to basin, again and again. They tended the braziers, the little glowing pans of coal that kept the great cold rooms from freezing. They dressed the hair of the women above them, arranging it with slow, practiced fingers. They carried in the meals and carried out the empty dishes, and a girl might spend the whole of her young life inside a single-walled compound she was not permitted to leave. Her entire world shrunk down to one courtyard, one mistress, one small set of rooms, and the constant, quiet fear of being noticed for the wrong reason. Because to be noticed was dangerous. A mistake, a spilled cup, a wrong word, a task done too slowly could bring punishment, and the punishments could be harsh. There was crowding and cold, and in some reigns the rations for the lowest servants ran thin, close to hunger. The palace memoirs and the later testimonies remember this. The ache of it, the smallness of it. Her day was measured out by those bells and watches, the routines beginning before first light. She woke in the dark, she worked through the day, she lay down in the dark again, and the walls did not change, and the courtyard did not change, and the seasons turned outside a gate she could not walk through. There was, in the Ming dynasty, a rule that a palace maid might be released once she reached a certain age. The regulations speak of letting women go once they were somewhere in their 20s or 30s. But rules on paper and life inside the walls are two different things, and in practice many of these women simply grew old inside the palace and died there, having never left. The Qing court, later, softened this. It let its banner maidservants go at around the age of 25, still young enough, the hope was, to return to the world, to marry, to have a life of her own after the years of service. Imagine what that release would have felt like. To walk out through a gate that had held you since you were a child. To feel open sky over your head with no wall around it. To be, for the first time in years, simply a person and not a function. Hold that girl in your mind for a moment as you drift, the child brought in at 13, the water carried before dawn, the far-off hope of a gate opening at 25. She is the ground floor of the whole vast building we are about to climb. And she is bound, though she may never know it, to everyone above her. Because the same power that could summon her, could summon anyone, could reach into any household and claim a body for its work. That claim on the body of the ordinary person is a thread we will follow all the way up. For now, let it rest. Let her rest. And let us step outside the palace walls entirely, into the open fields, where the great mass of people lived and worked under the wide sky. Here is the farmer, the peasant, bent over his land. And here we meet one of the strangest, gentlest ideas in this whole old world, the idea of the four occupations, the sem. In the thinking of the scholars, all the ordinary people of the empire could be sorted into four kinds, and those four kinds were ranked, one above the other. At the top of this ideal ladder stood the scholar, the man of learning. And just beneath him, second from the top, honoured, praised, called the very root of the state's wealth, stood the farmer, the nung. Beneath the farmer came the artisan, the gung, the maker of things with his hands, and at the very bottom, below them all, sat the merchant, the shung, whom we will meet later. So in the mind of the empire, in its poems and its teachings, the farmer was noble. The farmer fed everyone. The farmer was the foundation on which the whole grand structure rested. That is the ideal. And the ideal was sincere. But the daily life of the peasant, out there in the mud and the weather, told a more complicated story. Because the one who was honoured in words also carried the heaviest of all the burdens in practice. Let us sit with him a while, this farmer, and see the year through his eyes. His fields were grain. In the north, where the land is dry and dusty and the winters bite, he grew millet, small, hardy, golden. In the south, where the rivers spread wide and the air hangs warm and wet, he grew rice. Standing in flooded paddies with the water around his ankles, and here is the first thread that ties him upward into the world above, he did not pay his taxes in coins. For most of this long history, he paid in kind, which simply means he paid in the thing itself, in grain. He filled sacks with the harvest he had grown with his own hands, and he carried those physical sacks, heavy on his shoulder, to a state granary or a collection point. The wealth of the entire empire was, quite literally, measured and stored as grain, mountains of it, sealed in great state storehouses. The rice and millet you can hold in your palm was the treasure of kings. Think of what that meant in the body. Not a number written in a ledger somewhere far away, but weight. The weight of the sack against your spine, the walk to the granary, the grain that came out of your own field and would never feed your own family, handed over because the state had claimed its share. And that grain, once given, did not simply vanish. It began a long journey, a journey we will follow, hundreds of miles, up rivers and canals, into distant storehouses, and finally onto the table of a man in an embroidered robe who the farmer would never meet. The grain in this barefoot man's sack becomes, in the end, another man's salary. Hold on to that quiet thread. We will pull it tight, much later, near the top of the stairs. But the grain was only one part of what the farmer owed. And to understand his life, we have to understand how the burden itself changed over the long centuries, slowly, the way everything in this world changed, over generations. In the days of the Tang dynasty, there was a beautiful and orderly idea called the equal field system, the jintin. The notion was simple and almost tender. The state would allot land to a household, a fair share to work and live from, and in return that household owed three things, and here the plainness of it is lovely. It owed grain, to feed the state. It owed labour, the work of the body, given in service. And it owed cloth, bolts of textile, woven at home, grain, body, and cloth, food, work, and warmth. The whole of what a person could give, gathered into a threefold obligation the scholars called the Xingdio, your harvest, your hands, and the cloth off your own loom. But systems like that are hard to hold together across a vast and changing land, and in time it strained and broke. And so, in the year 780, a chief minister named Yung Yin devised something new, the two-tax system, the Lingshu F. Instead of taxing the person, this new way taxed the land and the property. It was assessed on what you owned, and it was collected twice a year, once in the summer, once in the autumn, following the rhythm of the growing seasons. It sounds like a small, dry piece of accounting, a change in how a tax was reckoned. But it was one of those quiet turning points where the whole basis of a person's obligation shifts beneath their feet, from taxing who you were to taxing what you held. And these reforms, these slow rewritings of the bargain between the farmer and the throne, would continue for another 1,000 years, each one trying to make the burden a little more bearable or a little easier to collect, or both. Still, the tax was never the whole of it. Above the grain, above whatever the changing law demanded, there was another claim on the peasant, and this one fell not on his harvest but on his body. It was called corv in Chinese, the yoi, and it was labour, unpaid, owed to the state. This is the same thread we first saw with the palace maid, the claim on the ordinary body, and here it is again, reaching into the fields. The farmer could be summoned to work, to build and repair walls, to dredge the mud from silted canals, to haul tribute along the roads, to raise palaces and dig the tombs of the great. He might be marched hundreds of miles from his home. And here is the cruelty hidden inside it, not the labour alone, hard as that was, but the timing. He could be taken during the very seasons he most needed to be in his own fields, at planting or at harvest, so that while he dug some distant ditch for the state, his own crop stood unplanted or rotted unharvested, and his own family went hungry for it. The dread was not only the work, the dread was being marched away, and the fear, quiet and constant, of never coming back. And even the land itself was often not truly his. Tenancy was everywhere. A great many of the people we would call peasants did not own the fields they worked at all. They rented them from a landlord, and the rent was steep. It could take half the crop. Half, so picture the layers now, gently, one atop the other. First, half your harvest to the landlord for the right to work his land. Then, on top of that, the state's tax in grain. Then, on top of that, the claim on your body, the labour you owed. And beneath it all, the weather, indifferent and vast. A single flood, a single year of locusts eating the fields bare, a single failed harvest, and a family that had been balanced on the edge could tip over into debt, and from debt into selling the last of the land, and in the darkest years into selling their own children, simply to survive. This was the life at the honoured second rung of the ladder, the life of the root of the state's wealth. And yet, I don't want to leave the farmer only in his burdens, because his world was not only weight and dread. His world was also a deep and ancient rhythm, a calendar so old and so wise that it shaped every day of his year, and it connected him. This is the wonder of it, directly to the man at the very top of everything, the emperor himself. Because the peasant's calendar was the state's calendar. The whole empire ran on a careful blending of the moon and the sun, the lunar months set against the solar year. And that solar year was divided into 24 small seasons, the 24 solar terms, gentle markers spaced through the turning year, each one naming a subtle change in the world. There was the term for the start of spring, and the one for the waking of insects, and the one called grain rain, and the one called great heat, and the coming of the cold dew, and the arrival of the great snow. 24 soft names for the year's slow breathing, telling the farmer when to plant and when to reap, when the frost would come and when it would break. And these solar terms were published for the whole land in the Imperial Almanac, a book of the year, sent out from the centre. Here is the beautiful, strange heart of it. It was the emperor, and the emperor alone who granted the seasons. As the Son of Heaven, the one who stood between the sky and the earth, it was his cosmic task to set the calendar right, to align the doings of people with the turning of the heavens. So when the humble farmer looked at his almanac to know the day to sow his millet, he was reading a gift that came down all the way from the throne, from the same distant centre that his sacked grain was, at that very moment slowly travelling toward. The lowest and the highest, bound together by a book of seasons and a bag of rice. The man in the paddy and the man in the palace, breathing the same year. Feel how far we have already come, and how gently. We began in a cold courtyard before dawn, with a girl of 13 carrying water drafted into a palace she could not leave. And we have stepped out into the wide fields, into the life of the farmer, honoured in word, burdened in deed, paying his tax in the weight of grain, owing his body to the labour draft, renting the very land beneath him, and living all the while by an ancient calendar of 24 soft seasons that came down to him from the throne. 2 rungs of the ladder, and already we can see the threads running between them, the claim on the body that reaches from the maid to the farmer, the grain that will travel upward, the calendar that binds the bottom to the top. Let all of that settle now, like silt drifting down through still water to rest on the bottom of a quiet pond. You do not need to hold any of the names. Not the Gon, not the Xian, not the Jintin or the Lingshuf, not the 24 solar terms. Let them wash over you, warm and unhurried, and let them go. They will still be here if you want them, and they will keep unfolding whether you follow or not. For now, notice the weight of your own body against the bed. Notice how the pillow holds your head, how you do not have to hold it yourself. Let your shoulders drop a little further than you thought they could. Let the small muscles around your eyes go loose and heavy. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to carry, no sack of grain, no bell before dawn, no long road away from home. The farmer's burdens are 2,000 years behind us, and were never yours to bear. All you have to do tonight is breathe, and drift, and let the staircase carry you gently upward while your body stays exactly where it is, warm and safe and still. And above the farmer, on the next rung, there waits a curious figure, a man who might have more coin in his strongbox than any farmer would see in 10 lifetimes, and who is none the less ranked beneath that farmer, looked down upon, hemmed in by laws about what he may wear and where he may sit. A man rich enough to buy almost anything in the world, except the one thing he wants most of all. He is the merchant, and his strange, comfortable, quietly frustrated life is where we are going next. But there is no hurry to get there. The stairs are wide and shallow, and the night is long, and we will take each step as slowly as sleep allows. So stay here a moment longer, in the space between the fields and the market, in the soft dark between one life and the next. Let your breathing find an easier, slower rhythm, in and gently out. Feel how each breath asks nothing of you. Let the images of the courtyard and the grain field blur softly at their edges, the way the last thoughts do before sleep, when the day loosens its grip and lets the mind wander somewhere kinder. The girl by the well, the sacks of golden millet, the almanac open on a rough wooden table, its pages naming the coming of the cold dew. All of it soft now, all of it far away, all of it carrying you down toward rest, as we prepare to climb, ever so gently, to the next quiet step of this very old and very patient world. Think, for a moment longer, about the girl we left standing in that courtyard, not as a figure in an old book, but as someone who once breathed the same quiet night air you are breathing now. She was perhaps 13 when the men from the capital came, walking through the villages the way the tax collectors did, only they were counting daughters instead of grain. In the Qing this had a name so gentle it hid what it was, the draft of maidens, the Xian, and under it the daughters of the banner families were written into registers, and no such girl could simply choose a husband and marry in her own village. She had to wait to be looked at first, to be reviewed, to stand in a line in the capital while strangers considered her height, her skin, the sound of her voice, the way she held her hands, and decided whether she would enter the great walls or be sent quietly home. And if she was kept, her days shrank to the size of a single courtyard. Imagine it softly, the way you might imagine a room in a house you lived in long ago. Sweeping, carrying water. Kneeling to tend the little braziers that kept a mistress warm. Folding and folding again the endless laundry of people far above her. Learning to dress another woman's hair so gently that the woman never felt the comb. Above her stood the matrons and the senior maids, and above them the consorts, and above them all, somewhere she would almost never see, the one man the whole vast house was built around. Her time was not measured in hours the way yours is. It was measured in bells and in watches, in the slow rounds of the palace night, and her whole world could be one gate, one mistress, and the small daily fear of being noticed for the wrong reason. In the Ming, the rules spoke of letting such women go when they were older, somewhere in their later years, and yet many of them simply aged inside those walls and died there, never marrying, never seeing the fields again. The Qing was a little kinder in this one respect. It let its serving women leave at around 25, still young enough to marry, still young enough to begin the ordinary life that had been paused for so long. Picture that too, if you like, a woman walking out through a gate she had entered as a child, blinking into a wider world. The courtyard, closing behind her like a held breath, finally let go. That is the strange arithmetic of that lowest rung. A whole youth spent in the shadow of the highest power in the land, and the reward at the end was simply to be allowed to become ordinary again. Let that image loosen and soften now, and let the staircase carry your thoughts one gentle step down and out, back into the open air. Back to the fields where the farmer stands. Because for all that the palace loomed so high above him, the farmer held a place in the order of things that the servant girl, and even the rich man we are climbing toward, could not claim. In the old Confucian picture of the world there were 4 kinds of people. The sem, the scholar first, then the farmer, then the artisan, and last of all the merchant. Second from the top, honoured, in the words the sages used, as the very root of the state, the one whose patient work in the mud fed every other mouth in the empire, from the artisan at his bench to the Son of Heaven at his distant altar. Honoured in words, loaded with weight in life. For it was from him, above all, that the state took what it needed. And for most of these long centuries it took not coins but grain itself, millet in the cold north, rice in the warm south, carried in real sacks on real shoulders to the granary gates. The wealth of the whole imperial machine, in the end, was piled and counted as stored grain. There were times, in the older dynasties, when the state handed a household its fields under the equal field system, the jintin, and asked back 3 things in return: grain from the harvest, labour from the body, and cloth woven at home, food and toil, and something warm to wear, folded into a single lifelong debt. Then, in a year we can still name, the 780th, a minister called Ying Yin rewrote the bargain. From then on the tax would come twice a year, once in the warmth of summer and once in the cooling of autumn, and it would be reckoned no longer on the person, but on the land and the goods a household held. The burden shifted its weight, ever so slightly, from the man to the acre. And still, beneath all of it, ran the oldest truth of that life, that so many who worked the soil did not own it. They rented it, and to the landlord they owed something close to half of everything they grew, and that half came before the tax, and before the labour still owed to the state. A single flood, a single season of locusts, a single hard winter could tip such a family from just barely enough into debt, and from debt into selling their land, and in the worst of years into decisions no parent should ever have to weigh. Yet here is the quiet mercy woven through even that hard life. The farmer did not face the year alone or blind. He faced it with a calendar older than any dynasty. The turning wheel of the 24 solar terms, each one a small named doorway in the year, the waking of insects, the grain rains, the white dew, the cold dew you already heard whispered a moment ago. And that calendar came down to him from the very top of the staircase we are climbing, printed in the Imperial almanac, because it was the emperor himself, the Son of Heaven, who was said to grant the seasons to his people. So even the man farthest from the palace lived his days by a rhythm handed down from its highest room, planting and reaping in time with a clock the emperor was thought to wind. And there is one more thread here, so fine you could almost miss it, and it is the thread that ties this whole night together. The grain in that farmer's sack does not stay in his village. It is only beginning its journey. It will be gathered and moved hundreds of miles along water that other men dug with their own broken hands, and it will come to rest in great state granaries near the capital, and from there it will be paid out again, not as grain to a farmer, but as the very salary of the lettered men who govern the empire. The rice this barefoot man is carrying will one day sit on a mandarin's table. But that is a step still far above us, and we will reach it slowly, in its own good time. For now, let all of it settle. The girl walking free from her gate, the sacks of grain beginning their long river journey, the almanac on the rough table naming the turning of the year. Let your shoulders sink a little deeper, let your jaw come unclenched, let each breath grow a touch longer and slower than the one before. Above us now, on the very next rung, a figure is beginning to take shape in the soft dark, a man with a strongbox full of coin and a heart full of quiet frustration. Ranked beneath the muddy farmer he could buy 10 times over. We are almost to him. We are almost to the merchant. But there is no need to hurry up that final step tonight. No need at all. The merchant arrived in a house of contradiction. Step up now onto this third rung of the ladder and look at what waits there. A courtyard larger than anything the farmer ever dreamed of. Lanterns of good paper hanging in rows, a smell of sandalwood from a brazier in the corner room, and beneath it the deeper smell of cedar from the strongboxes stacked against the inner wall. Fine ceramic cups on a low table, and on a peg near the door a robe of dark plain cotton, worn not for poverty but for law. Because the merchant, for all his wealth, was not permitted the silk. That was the first thing, and it was not a small thing. In the ordering of the empire's 4 callings, the Sem, the 4 kinds of people, the merchant, the Xing, stood last. Scholar first, then farmer, then artisan, and then the merchant, at the bottom of a hierarchy that organized the entire world of social meaning. The irony of it could fill a library of bitter essays, and over the centuries many men tried. The farmer, ranked above the merchant in every system of thought, hauled grain in the dark and bent his back to earth he might not even own. The merchant, ranked below him, sat in a warm room and moved paper and silver. And yet the order was firm, and its logic was, within its own terms, coherent. The farmer fed the earth. The artisan made things from the earth. The scholar served heaven. But the merchant, what did the merchant make? Nothing. He only moved what others made, and pocketed the difference. So said the Confucian orthodoxy that the state breathed like air. This was not merely an idea held in the minds of scholars. It was written into the fabric of daily life in ways that bit like cold wind. Sumptuary law, the regulation of what each rank of person was allowed to wear, carry, display, had teeth. At various periods of the empire, merchants and their families were forbidden from wearing silk, from riding in certain carriages, from adorning their persons with ornaments permitted only to men of office. A merchant could drape his inner walls with silk, could dress his concubines in it, could sell it by the bale to half the empire, but on his own body, the plain cotton of his station. The wealth was there, its visible expression was not permitted, and there was another door that stayed, in principle, at least partly closed. The civil examination, the great kijé, the machine of imperial meritocracy, the ladder that theoretically allowed any free man's son to rise, was not fully open to the merchant class in all periods. Restrictions on whether merchants' sons could sit the exam shifted across the dynasties, loosening and tightening with time and fiscal desperation. But the shadow of the bar remained. You could be rich beyond counting and still find the most powerful door in the empire harder to approach than it was for a farmer's bookish boy. So the merchant did what intelligent people always do when one door is partly shut. He found another way through. The state was practical about some things, even when it was not practical about others. It sold status. Not quietly, not reluctantly, but with a system the practice scholars called jun or jun-gun, the purchase of titles, degrees, and official standing by those with the coin to pay. When the treasury was pressed, a campaign on the northern border, a flooding yellow river demanding emergency dikes, a famine requiring distribution from the imperial granaries, the state offered its prestige for sale. A rich merchant could buy himself an honorary degree. He could purchase a rank, a title, a status that placed him, on paper, in the class of gentlemen. He could buy examination candidate, standing for his son, opening that otherwise narrowed door. The wealth could be laundered into respectability, slowly, across a generation or two, if the family was careful and the son was clever. The great salt merchants of Yangzhou in the Qing dynasty became the most spectacular demonstration of all this tension. Salt was a state monopoly. The government controlled the right to produce and distribute it, issued licenses to merchants who would operate within its system, and those merchants, the licensed salt traders of the lower Yangtze, accumulated wealth on a scale that stunned foreign visitors and alarmed court officials in equal measure. The salt merchants of Yangzhou in the Qing were among the richest men on earth. They built gardens of such elaborate beauty that poets travelled weeks to see them. They financed scholarship, sponsored opera troupes, collected paintings. And when the Qing Qianlong Emperor made his famous tours of the south, 6 great imperial progresses through the wealthy lower Yangtze, it was substantially the Yangzhou salt merchants who paid for the reception, the lodging, the spectacle of it all. Vast sums, offered with both hands and a very deep bow. And still, formally, the salt merchant was a merchant, still at the bottom of the 4 callings. The bow he made to a third-rank official who earned in a decade what the merchant spent on a single banquet was not a bow between equals. There is something quietly human in that. A man can own more than he can count and still lie awake in his fine room, wondering whether he has arrived anywhere that matters. The merchant's deepest longing was not, in the end, another strongbox. It was a son. Not just any son, a son who would study, who would sit the exam, who would climb out of the merchant's shadow and into the light of the scholar's world, who would transform the family name in a single generation from Sheng to Sh, who would become the one thing his father's coin could almost but not quite purchase. Because you could buy a title, you could not buy the thing itself. Consider what the merchant handled day by day in that plain cotton life of complicated wealth. His world ran on three things: copper, silver, and paper, in ascending order of sophistication. The humblest was the copper cash, the round coin with a square hole at the center, strung on cords so they could be carried and counted. A string of 1,000 such coins had a name, a gun, or sometimes a dio, and that string was a unit of reckoning in the everyday transactions of the empire. Peasants paid small amounts in copper. Markets ran on copper. The weight of it was real. 1,000 copper coins strung on a cord was a mass you could feel in your arms, and in parts of the empire the copper supply fluctuated badly enough that the coins themselves shrank and thinned, debased through the centuries until they were nearly worthless. Some regions ran on iron coins instead of copper, which made the problem of carrying large sums genuinely physical. This is why the second medium, silver, mattered so much. Silver moved in the merchant's world by weight, not by coin. The unit was the ling, the tael, a weight of pure silver cut from bars and ingots. Weighed on small balance scales, its purity assessed by eye and touch, and sometimes by the nick of a small blade. There were no standardized silver coins in the Chinese imperial system for most of its history. Silver moved as bullion, and every serious transaction involved the balance. The merchant's scale was as much his instrument of work as the farmer's hoe. And then, more remarkable than either, paper. Among the many things that emerged from China before anywhere else on earth, the world's first government-issued paper money was born here, in the Song dynasty, growing from a practice among Sichuan merchants who had simply grown exhausted with the weight of iron coins. The Sichuan region ran on iron rather than copper, and iron is heavy. To move large sums in iron coin was to organize something closer to a freight operation than a financial transaction. So merchants began depositing their iron at trusted houses and carrying paper receipts instead. The state saw the logic, took over the practice, and issued the jiaozi, paper notes backed, in theory, by reserves of metal. The world's first paper money, in a dynasty that also gave the world printing on a movable scale. The merchant who carried a sheaf of jiaozi instead of a cart of iron was living in the future before most of the world had dreamed of it. Across the later dynasties, other merchant innovations filled the gaps that the state's system left. The Shaanxi merchants, great trading networks organized by home region, the men of Shaanxi province who moved through the empire like a quiet family, created what were perhaps the world's first truly sophisticated private banking institutions, the pioho, the draft bank. A merchant in the south could deposit silver at a Shaanxi pioho branch, receive a draft, carry that paper across 1,000 miles of road, and present it at another branch in the north for the equivalent amount in silver. No coin carried. No silver hauled through bandit country. only paper and the trust that had built up across decades of dealing. It was elegant, it was practical, and the men who built it were, in the empire's formal estimation, men of the lowest of the four callings. That dissonance between the reality of what the merchant class created and sustained and the official contempt in which it was held was one of the great engines of human aspiration in the empire. It drove sons to study. It drove fathers to spend fortunes on tutors and books and the hope of a different future. It made the examination, the courtyard, the most charged institution in the whole civilization. Not just a test, a transformation machine, a door between worlds, and it is time now to step through it. The imperial examination had roots that reached back to the Sui dynasty, to the late 6th and early 7th century, when the emperor the historians call Yingde, the second Sui emperor, the same man who later poured millions of lives into the Grand Canal, began formalizing written examinations as a path to government appointment. The idea was not entirely new. Some form of examination and recommendation had existed before. But the Sui and then the Tang dynasties gave it shape, and the Song dynasty gave it dominance, and the system that resulted, refined and expanded and made ever more elaborate over the following centuries, endured until 1905, when the last Qing dynasty finally abolished it. Over 1,300 years. Consider that span. 13 centuries during which the principal method of selecting the men who governed a civilization was a written examination on the Confucian canon. There is nothing quite like it in the history of any other empire. Anywhere, the system worked in stages, each one a higher gate, each one requiring years more preparation and a more comprehensive mastery of the texts. At the base, the local and prefectural examination produced the xingyun, the licentiate, the entry-level degree holder, commonly known by the warmer name siqi, which meant something like budding talent. The siqi was gentry. His household was freed from corv obligation. He could wear a particular style of robe. He was addressed differently. He had crossed from commoner to the class that bordered officialdom, even if he never climbed another rung. For many families, the siqi was enough, a generation-transforming achievement in itself. Above the xingyun sat the junren, the recommended man, obtained at the provincial examination held in the capital of each province once every 3 years. The provincial exam was a far more serious ordeal than the local one. Men travelled weeks to reach the examination grounds. They had often been preparing since childhood, and many had sat and failed this exam before, some more than once, some many times. The GRN degree made a man eligible for official appointment. It was not a guarantee of office, but it was the credential that put the door within reach. A GRN in a family was cause for celebration across 3 generations. Above the GRN came the metropolitan examination, held at the capital, producing the Gengsh. And above that, the summit, the palace examination, the Dinsh, held nominally in the presence of the emperor himself, which sorted the Gensh into the final degree, the Gensh, the presented scholar. The Gensh was the empire's most coveted credential. The men who held it governed provinces, advised the throne, drafted the documents that moved the empire. They were the living top of the intellectual hierarchy that Confucian civilization had built. And at the very peak of the Jiansh list, 3 names stood apart. The Zhongyun, first place overall, the highest examination result in the entire empire for that sitting of that year. A national celebrity. His name was announced in the capital with ceremony. His home district might erect an archway in his honor, carved in stone, to stand for generations. The Bingjin, second, the Tnu, third, a word that carries the image of searching for a flower. These were not merely good students. They were the brightest measured men of a civilization of hundreds of millions, and the empire knew it and said so. But here the sleep of the numbers must give way to the texture of the thing. Because the examination was not only an intellectual experience, it was, above everything, a physical one. The provincial examination took place in dedicated examination compounds, walled cities of individual testing cells, row upon row, tens of thousands of them. The most famous of these was the Jiangnan Examination Hall at Nanjing, which held more than 20,000 individual cells. 20,000 tiny brick chambers, each one barely large enough to contain a man and a pair of boards. One to sit on, one to write at. The candidate was locked into his cell for the duration of the exam, which lasted several days across multiple sittings. He slept there, on his board. He ate what he brought with him. He wrote by the light that came through the open front of his cell when the weather allowed, and crouched in the dark when it did not. In the cold months, men shivered over their brush and ink. In the summer heat of a Nanjing August, the cells became kilns. There are records of candidates dying inside the examination grounds, from cold, from heat, from illness, from the sheer accumulated weight of a lifetime of effort come to nothing in a few days. And the cheating. Because, of course, there was cheating, and because the stakes were so high, it became an art form. Candidates smuggled what the examiners called crib garments, robes with the Confucian texts written across the inner lining in characters so small they could only be read with a careful eye and good light. Miniature books were produced for this purpose. Whole classical texts compressed into volumes small enough to hide in a food vessel or a shoe, the characters printed in a hand so fine that the printing itself was a kind of craft. Surviving examples of these tiny examination aids, kept now in museum collections, are almost beautiful objects, the desperation of 1,000 students' hopes, compressed into something you could close in a palm. Examiners searched bodies and food and the fur lining of winter robes. Impersonation, paying a more gifted man to sit the exam under your name, was a capital adjacent crime. Bribery, theft of examination questions. The arms race between hope and supervision ran the full length of the system's 13 centuries. And then the waiting. The results announced, the lists posted. The moment of reading whether your name was there or was not. Most names were not there. The failure rates were immense and deliberate. Passing the provincial examination might mean that you had succeeded where 99 of 100 candidates had not. A pass rate of 1% was not unusual for the provincial level in a well-subscribed region. This was not accident. It was policy. The number of officials the empire required was fixed, roughly, by the size of the administration, and the examination was calibrated to produce approximately that many qualified men, no more. The surplus of candidates was the fuel that made the system credible. You could not pass by luck or by being merely good. You had to be, on that particular set of days, among the sharpest handful in your province. Which meant that men failed. Repeatedly, across years, across decades. The image that most fully captures the human weight of this fact is the one that seems, at first glance, almost comic. The elderly candidate, the man in his 70s or 80s, thin and white-haired, and still carrying his examination box through the gates of the compound for another attempt. There are documented cases. The court occasionally acknowledged these aged perennial candidates with honorary degrees, gestures of respect for a lifetime of persistence that had not quite arrived. But the degrees were honorary because the men had not passed. They had spent their lives trying, and the thing had not come. Consider what that means in a family. A grandfather who tried, a father who tried, a son who tries now. The money spent on tutors across 3 generations, tutors who taught the 4 books and 5 classics, the Confucian canon that formed the examination's entire substance. The Analects of Confucius, the Mencius, the Great Learning, the Doctrine of the Mean, the Book of Songs, the Book of Documents, the Book of Rites, the Book of Changes, the Spring and Autumn Annals. Texts memorized, internalized, recited from sleep, and argued in the written form the examiners demanded. Not read once, but lived inside, until the passages came to mind the way a familiar road comes to the feet without thinking. The form in which those arguments had to be made was itself a discipline of extraordinary rigidity. The Ming and Qing dynasties required a written answer structured as the beggar, the 8-legged essay. 8 legs, 8 required parts, each serving a defined function in the argument's unfolding, each carrying its own weight in the architecture of the whole. A candidate who wrote brilliantly outside that structure was not brilliant. He was failed. The 8-legged essay was prized by its defenders as a supreme training in disciplined thought, in the mastery of form as a kind of virtue. It was criticized, increasingly through the late Ming and Qing, as a cage that rewarded imitation over insight, technique over mind. Both things were probably true. The form constrained, and the constraint was also a skill, and the skill was real, and real minds were trapped inside it. That argument has never quite been resolved. For the sleep-quiet listener drifting through these examination halls in imagination, the thing to hold is this: the kedger was not fair, in the way we now mean that word. Wealth bought tutors, and good tutors produced better results. Purchasing a candidate's status, that loophole the merchant used, meant that the exam was not a pure filter, only a partly meritocratic one. And the content it tested was a single tradition, the Confucian one. Ignoring mathematics, engineering, agronomy, medicine, and the practical knowledge by which the empire actually ran its waterways and its granaries. It was a test of literary mastery in a specific classical tradition, and what it selected was men who had spent the longest time in the deepest immersion in that tradition. And yet, within those limits, it was something remarkable. Across 2,000 years of Chinese history, in a world where most societies assigned rank purely by birth, where the son of a nobleman was a nobleman, and the son of a ploughman was a ploughman, and the line was nearly never crossed, the examination offered to any free man's son who could find and afford the books and the time a path. Not a comfortable path, not a likely path, not a path free of obstacle and accident, but a real path, and a path that had been walked. Farmers' sons had passed, sons of artisans had passed, sons of minor clerks in backwater towns, sons of men who had themselves sat the exam and failed, had sat and passed and walked out of the examination hall into a different world than the one they had been born into. When a man received his juran degree, his household changed immediately. New legal protections, exemption from certain taxes and labour obligations. A social standing that affected every person living under that roof. When his son received the jinch, the change was complete. The family was gentry. The family was shinch. The merchant's great longing, the one no amount of salt money had been able to buy outright, could happen here. In 3 days of locked cells and cold rice, and a brush moving across examination paper by the compound's thin winter light. This is the door that stands between the bottom of this pyramid and the top of it. And it is worth pausing here, in the quiet, to feel the weight of what it meant, not as an institution in a textbook, but as a lived thing. A boy of 12, at a rough table in a provincial town, learning to write the opening move of the 8-legged essay by lamplight, while his father's grain sacks wait by the door. A man of 40, entering the Jiangnan Examination Hall for the 4th time, carrying his brushes and his ink and the faint probability of something different. A father waiting, somewhere outside the locked compound walls, for a posted list of names that may or may not include the word that would change everything. The list was posted. The crowd gathered around it. And someone in that crowd, reading down the column of characters, found the name they had been looking for, or did not. And the world arranged itself accordingly, and life continued, and the empire moved on, and the grain moved north along the canal, and the palace maids swept their courtyards before dawn, and the merchant counted his silver in the privacy of his plain cotton life. The pyramid held. The examination held the pyramid together because it held the possibility that the pyramid was not fixed, that a crack ran through every floor, and a careful man with good brushwork could climb through it. That crack was the most important architectural feature of the entire structure. Without it, the thing might have calcified into something purely hereditary, purely self-replicating, unreachable by anyone born below a certain line. With it, there was not equality, nothing so modern and simple as that, but permeability, the sense that the rungs above were, in principle, open, that the scholar official at the top of the 4 callings was not there because of blood, and was not beyond reach because of blood. He was there because of the 4 books and 5 classics, and 3 days in a tiny brick cell. And anyone, the merchant's son, the farmer's son, the boy studying by lamplight in a village that had never produced a jinshi in living memory, could, in principle, do the same. This is the particular cruelty and the particular grace of the Kidja, held in balance across its 13 centuries. Cruelty in the crushing odds, the wasted decades, the old men with their honorary degrees and their unanswered decades of work. Grace in the genuine exceptions, the documented cases of men born at the bottom who climbed to something near the top, and transformed not just their own lives, but the social memory of what was possible. And the man who climbed through that crack, who carried his J-inch degree into the official world, who was appointed to his first post, who put on for the first time the robe with its embroidered panel on chest and back, that man is waiting for us now, 1 rung higher still. He is the mandarin. He is the scholar official, the living embodiment of what the examination produced, the human proof that the whole elaborate, painful, centuries-long machinery of the KJ was worth what it cost. He governs a district of perhaps hundreds of thousands of people. He is the face of the empire to every farmer and merchant and servant below him. His salary is paid in the grain that the farmer carried to the state granary, that the canal boats moved north through the flat water between the rushes. The circle, the one we began tracing at the bottom of the pyramid, is almost closed, but we are not quite there. Let your breath settle here for a moment, in this quiet between the examination hall and the yamen of the new official. Let the image of the posted list fade, and the crowd dispersing, and the long roads back to provincial towns carrying either grief or joy. Let all of that sit. Above us now, the pyramid continues its slow ascent. And the air is a little different up here, colder in its way, more formal. The robe has an embroidered bird on it, and the bird tells you everything if you know how to read the language of feathers. The bird is a crane. Not a painted crane, not a suggested crane, but a crane worked in silk thread on a square panel of embroidered cloth, the bzai, the rank badge, sewn onto the chest of the robe and onto the back, so that whoever approaches the mandarin from either direction sees it, reads it, understands in an instant where this man sits on the great ladder of imperial rank. The crane is the highest civil bird. It belongs to a first-rank official, and to see one in the courtyard of a yamen, the district headquarters where the magistrate lived and worked and held court, was to know you were standing before a man at the absolute summit of the civilian world below the emperor himself. There were 9 ranks in all, called the jip, the 9 grades of official standing, and each was divided into an upper and lower step, so that in practice there were 18 distinct rungs within the system, a ladder within the ladder, which is a very imperial thing to have. Every official had a place on this ladder, a precise coordinate in the universe of rank, and the rank was not merely a matter of pride or ceremony, it governed what you wore, how you were addressed, what punishment a court could impose on you without special imperial approval, how much of your salary you received, and what embroidered creature lived on your chest and your back. The crane was first rank. Below it, on the second-rank official's robe, you would find the golden pheasant, brilliant, elaborate, a bird whose every feather seemed to have been designed for display. Third rank wore the peacock, whose feather was also the raw material of another prize we will come to in a moment. Fourth rank, the wild goose, a bird of long migrations and cold skies. Fifth rank, the silver pheasant, quieter than its golden cousin. Sixth rank, the egret, white and still as a sentence that has finished. Seventh rank, the mandarin duck, whose domestic faithfulness made it a symbol of married constancy and which appeared here perhaps with some gentle irony, given the world its wearer inhabited. Eighth rank, the quail. Ninth rank, the lowest civil official, the paradise flycatcher, a small bird of trails and margins, lovely in its way, but near the bottom of the feathered hierarchy. Military officials wore not birds, but beasts. The first-rank military man's badge showed the qilin, a creature that appeared in Chinese cosmology as a sign of the sage ruler's virtue, composite and magnificent, stepping through the world without harming a single blade of grass. Below the qilin, the lion, the leopard, the tiger, the bear, the panther, and then rhinoceros and seahorse as the grades descended. The exact arrangements shifted slightly from the Ming to the Qing, as these things did over the centuries, but the principle held across the dynasties. Civil officials were birds. Military officials were beasts, and the distinction told you something important about how the empire thought of its 2 kinds of power, the civil governing with grace and learning, as birds move through air, and the military governing with force and presence, as beasts move through the earth. Above the badges, there was the hat. An official's cap had a finial at its crown, the dongzi, a small ornamental button that from a distance was the first thing a sharp eye would catch. The highest-ranking officials wore a ruby-red finial. Below them came coral, then sapphire, then lapis lazuli, then crystal, then white shell, and so downward through the gradations of mineral and colour to gold at the lower steps. A man who knew his dynasty could read the whole social order from a finial at 50 paces. And then, for those whom the emperor wished to honor with something beyond rank, a particular service, a particular favor, a moment of imperial pleasure, there was the peacock plume, the hulung, granted personally, worn behind the hat so it curved over and down. A single-eyed plume meant 1 degree of honor. 2 eyes, more, 3 eyes, 3-eyed peacock plumes were among the rarest and most coveted marks in the empire. To wear one was to carry the emperor's notice on your person, visible to everyone who looked. All of this, the birds, the beasts, the finials, the plumes, was not vanity, or not only vanity. It was information. It was the empire communicating with itself across the vast distances of its own territory, in a language that could be read without words. In a world of limited communication, where orders travelled at the speed of a horse and courts sprawled across continents, visible hierarchy was functional. The crane told you whom to bow to before you opened your mouth. The ruby told you whose word could override your own. The system was a kind of clothing-based bureaucracy, layered on top of the paper one, always working. And the mandarin at the centre of it all, what was he actually doing, day by day, in the district to which the emperor's appointment had sent him? He was governing, which meant he was, in the first instance, everything at once. The county magistrate and the county level was where most people in the empire ever encountered imperial government, held within his office the functions that modern states distribute among a dozen separate institutions. He was the judge. If a man was murdered in his district, the magistrate was the investigator, the prosecutor, and the jury. He performed the post-mortem examination himself or supervised it, guided by legal manuals that had accumulated over centuries and told him precisely where to look on a body for the marks of different causes of death. He was also the tax collector, responsible for ensuring that the district's assessed quota of grain and silver reached the state granaries and treasuries on time. He was the civil engineer, overseeing the maintenance of roads, bridges, irrigation channels, and city walls within his territory. He was the schoolmaster's patron and the temple's inspector, and he was, in the phrase the language gave him, the FM gun, the father and mother official, which meant that the people of his district were, in some sense, his children, and their welfare was his responsibility in the way a parent's was, which is to say entirely, and without excuse. He governed a district of perhaps hundreds of thousands of people. He did this alone, or nearly. He had a private staff, men called shai, secretaries and advisers he hired himself from his own salary, because the imperial government provided him with only a skeleton of official assistants. The clerks and runners who actually moved through the district, collecting taxes and serving court documents, were local men, often hereditary in their positions, who knew every family and every field and every grievance better than any outsider could. This made them indispensable. It also made them dangerous, because an official who could not speak the local dialect and did not know the local landscape was, in practice, entirely dependent on men he nominally commanded. The rule of avoidance was the reason for this structural vulnerability, and also the reason the rule existed. An official could not serve in his home province. A man from Fujian would be posted to Shandong. A man from Yunnan would govern in Shaanxi. The logic was clear. Serving in your home region meant serving among your family, your old friends, your creditors and debtors, your obligations and your resentments. It meant that justice would be shadowed by relationship. So the empire sent its officials as strangers, ruling places they had never seen, speaking to people in an official literary language that bore little relation to the sounds coming out of the mouths around them, dependent on local brokers from the moment they stepped off their travel boat. It was a system designed to prevent one kind of corruption while creating the conditions for another. And then there was the salary. The mandarin's salary was, by deliberate policy, low. Historically, official stipends were calculated partly in a unit of grain, the very grain that the farmer had carried to the granary in level 2 of this story, now returned to circulation as the currency of state compensation. The salary combined a grain measure with a smaller payment in silver. A county magistrate's nominal annual compensation was genuinely insufficient to run his office, pay his private secretaries and personal staff, maintain the physical yamen, cover entertainment costs that protocol demanded, and still have enough to eat at the standard his rank required. This was not an oversight. It was a structural feature. The low salary was paired, in practice, with a system of customary additional fees that everyone knew existed and that no one in the system acknowledged in official paperwork. The most famous of these was the huho, the meltage fee. Silver paid to the government had to be melted down and recast into standard ingots for the treasury. There was always some loss in the melting, wastage, slag, imprecision, so a surcharge was levied to cover this loss. In practice, the surcharge was far larger than the actual loss, and the excess went to fund the apparatus of local government and, by custom, to the magistrate himself. Everyone in the chain knew this, the farmers who paid it, the clerks who collected it, the magistrate who received it, the provincial officials who reported on it. All of them understood that the formal salary was only part of the story. The informal system was the other part, and without it, the formal system could not function. This arrangement was ancient, accepted, and profoundly unsatisfying to any emperor with reformist instincts. The Yongzheng emperor, who ruled in the early 18th century and was known among his successors for an almost ferocious diligence, looked at this structure and decided to try to fix it from within. His solution was the Yinglin Yin, the money to nourish incorruptibility, a large supplementary salary payment made directly to officials, meant to bring their real income up to a level where honest administration was financially possible. The theory was that a man who was adequately paid had less reason to steal, and a man who had less reason to steal might actually not steal. Whether the reform worked as cleanly as its designer hoped is a question historians have continued to debate, as they debate most things about institutions that interact with human nature over long timescales. What it tells us is that the empire's rulers were not ignorant of the problem. They knew what they had built. They disagreed, as reformers and realists always do, about what could be changed without breaking everything else. The mandarin who survived all of this, the inadequate salary, the hostile clerks, the alien dialect, the impossible caseload, the ritual obligations, the constant risk of censure by the censorate officers whose job was to watch for official misconduct, that man earned something real. He earned the crane on his chest. He earned the hat finial catching the light. He had come through the exam cells, through years of study, through the filters of the provincial and metropolitan examinations, and he had arrived at a place in the world that his grandfather and his grandfather's grandfather could perhaps not even have imagined. He was the living proof of what the examination system offered, not a perfect meritocracy. Because wealth bought tutors and time and books, and even, If the treasury was desperate enough, official titles outright, but a visible, functional ladder that anyone with enough years and enough discipline and enough hunger could, in principle, climb. Below the mandarin, in ways and places the mandarin could not fully see, someone else was also climbing, or trying to, or had already climbed so far by a different route that the conventional language of rank barely applied to him. The eunuch, the hungun, the tijin, occupied a position so strange in the architecture of imperial China that it almost defies simple description. He had no rank in the Confucian four occupations scheme. He sat outside the neat pyramid of scholar, farmer, artisan, and merchant. He could not sit the examination. He held no hereditary title. He could not, in the ordinary sense, found a family, and the Confucian world was organized around families, the reverence of ancestors, the care of descendants, the great chain of filial obligation stretching backward and forward through time. A eunuch was cut loose from all of that by the act that had made him what he was. And yet, his physical position inside the inner quarters of the palace, moving through rooms that no other man could enter, present at the emperor's rising and sleeping and eating and deciding, gave him an access to the center of power that the highest-ranked mandarin in the land could only observe from a distance, through the formal ceremony of audience, in a hall where prostration was required, and eye contact with the throne was barely permitted. The eunuch brought the emperor his morning tea. He carried the memorials from the outer bureaucracy into the inner halls. He stood beside the throne while the emperor thought aloud. The mandarin had rank. The eunuch had nearness. And nearness, in a system where everything flowed from a single sovereign will, was a kind of capital that rank could not always match. The surgery that made a man a eunuch removed both organs completely. What was removed, called the bow, the treasure, was traditionally preserved. Pickled, kept in a sealed container, stored carefully. A man could show his bow as proof of his status when required, and at his death it could be buried with him, restoring, at least in the imagination of the afterlife, the wholeness that palace service had cost him. He wanted to enter the next world entire. He wanted to face his ancestors, in whatever form that meeting took, without the visible sign of what he had given up for a life inside the gates. The jar, small and sealed, was carried through a life of service and ceremony and proximity to power, and then it went into the ground. There is something in that detail, the careful preservation of what was lost, that stays with you. It is not easy to call it sentimental. It is too specific for sentiment. It is just a man keeping something that was his. Some of the men who became eunuchs had been castrated in childhood by families too poor to refuse the opportunity or too desperate to consider its implications. Others chose it as adults, a calculated gamble on a path out of poverty and into a world, however constrained, of relative security. The court at certain periods had more candidates than positions, because the palace life, for all its restrictions, offered food, shelter, and the remote but real possibility of rising to something extraordinary. The state periodically had to turn men away, and some of those who had already performed the surgery on themselves, outside any official process, without guarantee of placement, found themselves neither accepted into service nor able to return to ordinary life. The gamble for them had simply not paid off. For others, it paid off beyond all comprehension. Zhougo served the Qin dynasty, the first imperial dynasty, the one whose first emperor unified the Chinese world in 221 BC. After the emperor's death on a distant journey, Zhou was involved in manipulating the succession, suppressing the legitimate heir, and placing on the throne a more manageable prince. He accumulated influence that made him, in practical terms, the most powerful man in the empire. And then, at some point in his ascent, he is said to have performed an experiment. He brought a deer into court, presented it to the young emperor, and announced that it was a horse. The emperor looked at the deer. He said it looked like a deer to him. Zhou turned to the assembled ministers and courtiers and asked them, was it a horse or a deer? Some said it was a horse. Some said it was a deer. Those who had said it was a deer, the ones who had trusted their own eyes over the eunuch's word, were subsequently found guilty of various charges and removed. The story has come down through the records of the grand historian, and whether the scene happened precisely as described, or whether it is the distillation of a truth about power into the shape of an anecdote. It names something real. The phrase "je lui mum," to point at a deer and call it a horse, entered the language as an idiom for the corruption of power so complete that truth itself becomes negotiable. Zhonghachi was a different kind of eunuch in a different kind of world. He served the Yongle emperor of the Ming in the early years of the 15th century, and he commanded the largest ocean-going fleet the world had yet seen. His ships, the famous treasure ships, dwarfed anything afloat in Europe at the time, great multi-masted vessels that sailed to Southeast Asia, to India, to the coast of Arabia, to the eastern shores of Africa. 7 voyages between 1405 and 1433. He brought back ambassadors and rare animals, giraffes, which the Chinese called klen, and received as signs of heavenly favor, and he extended the formal tributary reach of the Ming emperor across the whole of the maritime world he touched. A Muslim from the southwest, born to a family that had made the pilgrimage to Mecca, commanding fleets in the name of a Confucian son of heaven, the texture of his life alone is a kind of unexpected connection. A figure who does not fit any simple category and is, perhaps for that reason, still vivid 6 centuries later. And then there is Wei Zhongxian, who is what happens when the eunuch's proximity to power meets a weak emperor and an absent bureaucracy. He served the Tianming emperor, an emperor who preferred carpentry to governance, who was genuinely skilled with his hands and genuinely uninterested in the documents and audiences that running the Ming Empire required. Into that absence, Wei Zhongxian expanded. He controlled the Directorate of Ceremonial, the Slien, which handled the flow of official documents between the outer bureaucracy and the imperial presence. Memorials came in from governors and ministers across the empire. They passed through the directorate. Fi Jingxin decided which ones the emperor saw, in what form, summarized how. He ran the Eastern Depot, the Dongcheng, a secret police organization that operated outside the normal judicial system, with the power to arrest, interrogate, and punish. He had critics removed. He had temples built to himself while he still lived, with inscriptions naming him a sage. His name and his titles accumulated like weather. He was, for a period, the empire. Not the emperor. He never pretended to the throne, but the hand that shaped what moved through the space between the emperor and the world. His fall came with the Tianming emperor's death and the accession of a new ruler, the Zhongxian emperor, who was neither indifferent nor manageable. Within months of the new reign, Wei Zhongxian was stripped of everything and sent into exile. He did not survive the journey. The temples were torn down, the inscriptions were chiseled away. The records of his administration were scrutinized and condemned. The vacuum he left exposed how thoroughly the official Confucian bureaucracy had been bypassed, and how much damage one man's proximity to one emperor's ear could do. The Qing dynasty, which replaced the Ming after 1644, had watched all of this from the outside, as the Manchu rulers watched the Ming from the north before their conquest. And they drew the obvious lesson. The Qing deliberately curtailed eunuch power. Eunuchs in the Qing palace were kept to household service. They existed. They were necessary in the inner quarters for the same reasons of propriety that had always made them necessary, but the corridors of administrative influence, the levers of document control, the possibilities of institutional accumulation that had made Wei Zhongxian possible, these were closed off. The Qing elevated instead their own trusted men from within the banner system. The hereditary military households that formed the Manchu ruling class's core institution. A different kind of proximity, a different kind of trust, a different architecture of dependence. But the eunuch in the Qing was more nearly what his job title actually said he was, a servant. The extraordinary career was, in the Qing reading of history, an aberration to be prevented, not a feature to be managed. And yet the paradox of the eunuch endures as a meditation on power itself. He had given up everything the Confucian world said mattered: lineage, family, the continuity of ancestors and descendants, the ordinary human wholeness that the four occupations scheme assumed as its foundation. And in giving it up, he had gained access to something the four occupations scheme could not formally accommodate. Power that came not from rank or land or wealth or learning, but from being present, from being there when the emperor was thinking, from being the hand that poured the tea. The lesson the eunuch's career quietly taught the empire over and over through 2 millennia was that the most powerful man in any system is not necessarily the most formally powerful. Sometimes he is the one who knows where to stand. Let your shoulders settle for a moment here. Let the palace walls go quiet and the embroidered birds on the robes go still. Let your breath find its own pace, slow and even, unhurried, the way water finds the lowest point without effort or decision. You have been climbing a long staircase tonight, from the cold courtyard of the palace maid to the rank-marked robe of the mandarin to the paradox of the man without rank who held the most powerful position in the empire. Each step has been lit by the specific light of real things: a crane in silk thread, a preserved jar, a deer called a horse, a fleet sailing toward Africa. Rest here for a breath. Feel the weight of the day, whatever it held, begin to settle away from your muscles. Let your jaw unclench just slightly. Let your hands open. You do not need to hold anything right now. And a quiet note, while the staircase pauses, after years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now learning comes easier, energy is real, and the mind stays sharp. Sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. And now we continue into the great artery that tied all of these levels together. Above the ranks and below the throne, there was a system so vast and so essential that the empire could not have functioned without it, and yet it is easy to overlook because it was in essence a river. Or rather, a river made by human hands, over human generations, at a cost of human lives that is almost impossible to hold in the mind all at once. The Grand Canal, the Yinj, which the language translates as the Great Transport River, was the bloodstream of the empire. And what moved through it, in both directions, was the substance that connected every level of this story to every other. Think again of the peasant farmer in the south, in the great rice-producing regions of the lower Yangtze. His family has worked the same fields for generations. The rice grows through the long wet summer, tended according to the 24 solar terms published in the Imperial almanac, planted and weeded and harvested at the times the heavens declared appropriate. Because the emperor, as son of heaven, was the one who granted the seasons and set the calendar that told the farmer when to act. At harvest, the farmer fills his sacks. Some of that rice feeds his family. Some pays the rent to the landlord, 50% of the crop in a bad tenancy, half of everything grown. And some of it becomes tax, coaling, tribute grain, assessed by the state and carried by the farmer to a local collection point, where it enters the vast machinery of the coin, the tribute grain transport system. From the collection point, the grain moves to the canal, and from the canal it begins its journey north. The Grand Canal, in its full length, ran for well over 1,700 kilometers, linking Hangzhou in the south to Beijing in the north, a distance greater than the length of many European countries, all of it managed, maintained, dredged, and kept passable by state authority and the bodies of conscripted workers. It did not spring into existence at once. The canal grew over centuries, different stretches dug and linked and redug by different dynasties for different immediate purposes, until the Sui emperor, known as Yingde, the one whose name means something like the brilliant emperor or the magnificent, and who is remembered in Chinese history with a complexity that such titles often mask, ordered the great unifying construction around 605 to 610 of the Common Era. What the Sui emperor accomplished was the binding together of several pre-existing waterways and new excavations into a single functioning artery connecting north to south. The scale of the labor was staggering. Millions of workers were conscripted, men from the districts along the planned route, and records suggest that women were drafted into some phases of the work as well, when the labor demands of the project outpaced what the male population alone could supply. They worked with hand tools, picks, shovels, baskets for moving earth, under conditions that killed many of them. They worked on a timeline that the emperor's ambitions had compressed to the point of cruelty. And the canal was finished. It was a genuine engineering achievement of the first order, a feat of hydraulic planning across the varied terrain and water-level differentials of the eastern Chinese plain that still commands technical respect. But it cost. And the cost was not only in lives lost during construction. It was in the resentment that mobilizing millions of laborers against their will and away from their farms during seasons when farming mattered generates in the people so mobilized. The Sui dynasty had already strained its legitimacy with other vast projects, including the repair and extension of the Great Wall in the north, and the canal construction was one strain too many. Revolts broke out across the empire. The Sui collapsed within decades of the canal's completion, its second emperor fleeing and then being killed, its royal line extinguished in the tumult of a general rebellion from which a new dynasty, the Tang, emerged to inherit both the imperial machine and the waterway that was now its essential spine. The canal was thus the Sui's greatest gift and its own destruction. It dug the artery that would nourish every empire that came after it, and it dug its own grave in the same motion. There is something in that, the vast project that outlasts the hand that built it, that serves the centuries while the builder disappears into them, that feels like a lesson. Though what lesson exactly depends on where you are standing when you ask the question. Under the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol rulers who conquered China and moved the imperial capital to what they called Dadu, and what later became Beijing, the canal was extended and rerouted to run more directly to the new northern capital. The Mongols were, in many respects, pragmatic administrators who took the hydraulic infrastructure of the territory they had conquered and made it serve their own capital's needs. The result was the approximately north-south line of the Grand Canal that later dynasties, including the Ming and Qing, maintained and depended on. By the time of the great Ming and Qing periods that give us so much of the vivid material of this story, the rank badges, the eight-legged essay, the forbidden city itself, the canal had been moving tribute grain for centuries, and an entire way of life had grown up along its banks and on its water. There were the granaries. The state maintained vast storage facilities, CNG, granaries, at strategic points along the canal and near the capital, built to receive the tribute grain from the south and hold it against the needs of the northern population, the armies, and the officials whose salaries were denominated in it. A well-stocked granary was a sign of good government and a cushion against famine. An empty or poorly managed granary was a sign of corruption, negligence, or disaster, and could contribute, in a bad enough year of flood or drought, to the kind of popular suffering that the Mandate of Heaven literature said heaven was watching for. Grain in a granary was not just food, it was legitimacy, stored. And there were the people of the canal itself, the grain transport soldiers and boat households whose entire lives were organized around the movement of the tribute fleet. These were hereditary populations registered in specific categories, living on and beside the water, in a way that the land-based four occupations scheme barely described. A family might spend generations on the same stretch of canal, their lives measured by the annual cycle of the northward journey, loading the grain in the south, working through the locks and the low-water sections and the seasonal hazards of the route, arriving at the northern granaries, unloading, and beginning the long return south before the weather made the journey impossible. Their children grew up knowing the depth of particular channels, the behaviour of particular lock keepers, the informal economies that had grown up at every stop along the route. They were a world within the world, invisible to the ranks above them, and essential to all of them. The tribute grain they moved fed not only the officials whose salaries it constituted. It fed the armies garrisoned along the northern frontier who defended the empire against the steppe powers that always pressed from beyond the wall. It fed the labourers who maintained the very canal they were moving through. The whole system was circular in the way that living systems tend to be. The grain that grew in the southern fields, taxed from the hands that planted it, moved through the artery of the canal, arrived in the northern granaries, and flowed outward as salary, as rations, as state capacity, and the state capacity expressed as military defence and administrative order and hydraulic maintenance was what kept the southern fields producing the grain in the first place. The loop was also visible in the tribute system in its other meaning, the one that governed China's relationship with the world beyond its borders. Foreign states that wished to trade with the empire, to have access to its goods and its markets, entered into a formal relationship that the Chinese court framed as tribute. Envoys arrived at the capital carrying gifts, rare animals, local products, things that the emperor's court would find exotic or beautiful or strategically interesting. They performed the proper ceremonies of submission, acknowledging the emperor as the center of the civilized order. And in return they received, lavishly, gifts that were typically worth more than what they had brought, plus the trade rights and the official recognition that made the journey worthwhile. It was a system that allowed commerce to proceed under a political framework that maintained the fiction of imperial centrality. Everyone knew what they were doing. The formalities were the price of access, and most of those who paid them found the price reasonable. The canal grain moved north. The tribute goods moved in and out of the capital. The salaries flowed to the officials. The officials administered the districts where the farmers grew the grain. The farmers paid the tax. And at the center of the whole turning mechanism, felt in every transaction, present in every regulation, the reason the magistrate had the authority to assess the tax and the soldier the authority to guard the canal was a single idea. A concept, a piece of political philosophy so elegant and so durable that it survived every dynasty that invoked it, including the ones whose fall it explained. But that idea, and the man at the center of it all, the one whose authority the whole structure rested on, they are waiting just ahead of us on the staircase. The air is thinner up here and quieter. The grain is still moving on the dark water. The crane on the magistrate's badge is still, somewhere far below in the courtyard of a yamen, catching the morning light. The canal boats are still, in your imagination, pushing north through the flat country between the rushes, their holds full of the south's harvest, the crews navigating by stars and memory and the accumulated knowledge of generations spent on this particular water. Let the sound of that movement carry you gently forward. There is a word for the claim the empire made on the body of every ordinary man. Yoi, corv, unpaid labour owed to the state, the way grain was owed, the way cloth was owed, a debt denominated not in coin or rice, but in weeks and months of physical work, performed wherever the state required, at whatever distance from home the project demanded. If the land tax was the claim on your harvest, corv was the claim on you. On your hands and your back and your legs, on the seasons of your life that could not be given back once spent. Think of what that meant in practice. You are a farmer in the northern provinces, say, sometime in the first years of the 7th century. The harvest is in. The grain has been sacked and carried to the collection point. You have perhaps a few weeks of winter quiet ahead, the kind of quiet that a farming family earns and guards carefully, the quiet of mended tools and stored food, and the particular ease that comes after the year's great effort is done. And then the notice arrives, or a neighbour comes to tell you, because the notice has come to his household. Men are required. A project of the state. You will report on a given day, carrying your own tools and enough food to last you some time, and you will march to wherever the work is being done, and you will work until the work is finished, or until your allotted time is up, whichever comes first. The Grand Canal, the Yin, the great transport river, the longest artificial waterway in the world. More than 1,700 kilometers of it, when fully extended, linking the rice-rich south, the city of Hangzhou and the great Yangtze Valley, to the capital in the north, threading through flat country and marshland, and the crossings of a dozen rivers. A thread of man-made water stitching the empire together from its southern rim to its northern crown. To walk the full length of it would take weeks. To understand it, you need to imagine not just the water, but the labour that preceded the water. The millions of ordinary bodies that moved the earth before a single boat could float. The great unifying construction of the canal came under the Sui emperor known as Yingde in the years around 605 to 610 of the Common Era. He wanted it fast. The resources of the empire were thrown at the project, which means the bodies of the empire were thrown at it. Because in a world before machines, resources and bodies were the same thing. Records speak of millions conscripted to dig and link the existing waterways into a single north-south corridor, men and, the sources claim, women as well, labouring in shifts around the calendar, through summer heat and the mud of spring. The human cost was immense. People died. People fled and were caught and brought back. Families were hollowed out by the absence of the men who did not return or who returned broken. And the project was finished, or close enough to finished, that the boats could run. But what the emperor built with those bodies, he also destroyed with them. The tax burden and the corv demands of the Sui were so crushing, the projects so vast and so simultaneous, the canal palace construction. Military campaigns in the northeast that the empire cracked. Rebellions rose. The dynasty that had unified China after centuries of division lasted only a few decades before it collapsed, drowned in the consequences of its own ambition. The Sui dug the canal, and in doing so dug its own grave. The Tang dynasty that followed inherited both the waterway and the lesson, and was careful, for a time, about how far it pushed the men in the fields. Later, under the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol rulers who had conquered China and made Beijing, which they called Dadu, the great capital, the centre of their empire, the canal was extended and rerouted. The older route had bent eastward through Shandong. The Yuan engineers cut a more direct path, pushing the waterway further north to reach Dadu, completing the north-south artery that the Ming and Qing would rely on for centuries afterward. More labour, more bodies, more of the invisible joy that made grand projects possible and made ordinary lives harder to bear. And then there is the wall. The Great Wall, the Wunl Chung Chung, the 10,000 li-long wall, is perhaps the most famous structure in the world, and also one of the most persistently misunderstood. The wall that the modern traveller photographs at Badaling, with its stone battlements and watchtowers stepping up and over the mountain ridges north of Beijing, is not the wall that Qin Shi Huang built. It is not ancient in that sense. It is overwhelmingly a Ming creation, built and rebuilt and reinforced across the 1400s and 1500s and into the 1600s, when the dynasty needed to hold back the Mongols and later the Manchu threat from the north. The stone and brick of those famous parapets, the crenellations and the beacon towers, belong to the Ming. The Qin Wall, the wall that Qin Shi Huang ordered, linked and extended around 220 BC from the remnant walls of earlier warring states, was mostly rammed earth. Compressed layers of soil and stone and rubble, tamped down in wooden frames until it set hard, durable enough, in stretches, to still leave traces in the northern landscape 2,000 years later. But nothing like the stone architecture the imagination usually supplies. To picture the labourers of the Qin era on the stone battlements of Badaling is to make a small but telling error, the kind that separates a surface understanding from a real one. The Qin men who built the wall built in earth. The Ming men who built the stone wall came 17 centuries later. What did not change was the labour. Hundreds of thousands of conscripts, soldiers and convicts drove the Qin wall across the frozen frontier, working in conditions that killed many of them. The northern border was remote, cold, and dangerous. Supply lines were long, the work was brutal. And tradition says, the sources say, in the way that legends carry the weight of a truth, even when the literal details are uncertain, that the dead were buried in or beside the works, that the wall was made partly of the people who built it. The most powerful expression of this truth is not a historical record, it is a legend. The story of Meng Jing. Her husband was seized by the Qin Corps and marched north to work on the wall. She waited. She prepared winter clothes for him because the north was cold and she was his wife, and it was what you did, the ordinary domestic act that love produces. She travelled to bring them to him, across the long distance between the warm home and the cold frontier, and when she arrived, she learned that he had died there, somewhere in the wall's construction. And her grief was so absolute, her weeping so profound, that a section of the Great Wall collapsed under the force of it, opening the earth to reveal his bones. This is a legend. The story says so, and historical care requires the distinction. But legends survive because they name something real. The Meng Jing story survived across centuries and dynasties and retellings because it named what was real about Corv on the wall, the seizure of the husband, the solitary waiting of the wife, the distance too great to cross easily, the death too common to be remarkable, the bones that were someone's son, someone's love, buried in the project of the state. The legend is not history, but it carries the history inside it, the way a river carries silt, invisibly, continuously, depositing it in you as you listen. Corv, then, is the foundation beneath the foundations. The canal rests on it. The wall rests on it. The capital's grain supply rests on it, because the canal that carries the grain was built by Corv hands and maintained by them, dredged and repaired by them when it silted, kept navigable by the ongoing claim the state made on the bodies of ordinary men. The peasant paid in grain, and then paid again in weeks of labour, and sometimes what he paid was his life, spent in a ditch or on a frozen hillside far from the fields where the grain was growing without him. But even this, even the vast demanding engine of corv and land tax and canal tribute, rested on something. Everything in the structure so far, the servant's courtyard, the peasant's sack of grain, the merchant's silver, the examination cell, the crane on the magistrate's robe, the eunuch's whispered counsel, the canal boat pushing through the dark, all of it rested on a single idea. The idea that made the whole tower possible, and the idea that could, without warning, take it all away. The mandate of heaven. Tianming. It is worth pausing here, letting the canal water settle, and listening to this concept carefully, because it is not quite what it first sounds like. It is not divine right, the European idea that a king rules because God chose him and his bloodline, and the choice is permanent. It is something more interesting and more dangerous than that. Something the people who invented it understood would be a double-edged thing from the very start. Around 1,000 years before the Common Era, the Zhou dynasty overthrew the Shang. The last Shang king was portrayed by the Zhou who were telling the story as a tyrant and a degenerate, a man who had failed his people and offended heaven through his misrule. And so heaven, the great impersonal moral order above the human world, had withdrawn its approval from him, had, in the language of the idea, revoked his mandate, and given it to the Zhou, who were therefore not rebels or usurpers, but agents of heaven's will, doing what heaven required. This is elegant. It is also, if you look at it straight, a theory of legitimate overthrow built into the founding legitimacy of the state. The Zhou did not just claim the right to rule, they claimed a right to rule that was conditional on virtue, that could be taken back if virtue failed, and that could be given to anyone, to any family, to any capable man, regardless of birth. Heaven was not choosing a bloodline. Heaven was choosing a performance, And when the performance deteriorated, when the ruler became corrupt, when the court became wasteful, when the taxes became crushing, when the canals silted and the granaries emptied, heaven would signal its disapproval, and eventually, if nothing changed, would signal it by allowing the dynasty to fall. How did you read heaven's disapproval in the world? Because heaven's dissatisfaction expressed itself through the world. In floods, when the rivers broke their banks and the farmland drowned and the grain rotted before it could be taxed. In droughts, when the fields cracked and the harvest failed and the people starved. In earthquakes, in eclipses, in comets crossing the sky at unexpected angles. In the birth of animals of unusual form. All of these were read as heaven's commentary on the state of the ruler's virtue, the way a very strict teacher might express displeasure through increasingly pointed signals before finally, reluctantly, failing the student outright. And above all, in rebellion. A successful rebellion was not merely military and political, it was cosmic confirmation. The fact that the rebel had succeeded, that heaven had allowed him to succeed, had not struck him down, had instead let the armies of the old dynasty dissolve and the new man prevail, was itself the evidence that the mandate had transferred. This is the dynastic cycle that Chinese historians wrote and rewrote across the centuries. A vigorous founder receives heaven's approval, builds something great, and then, across the generations, the dynasty grows fat and slow and corrupt. The harvests fail, the taxes rise, the people suffer, the signs accumulate, and finally a new man rises from somewhere, from a general's tent, from a rebellious province, sometimes from the very bottom of society, and succeeds, and his success is its own proof. The cycle is not just a description. It is a framework that shaped how people understood everything that happened. When the Yellow River flooded catastrophically, it was not only a disaster, it was a question. What does this mean about the Son of Heaven's virtue? When a comet appeared, the astronomers of the Imperial Bureau watched it and wrote their reports with a particular kind of care. Because the report was not only astronomical, it was political, perhaps even dangerous. And when a rebel with a ragged army began winning battles that should have been lost, the soldiers of the dynasty found themselves facing not only an enemy but a cosmological doubt. Was the mandate already gone? Zhongxian understood this. He had to. He was, at the beginning, the furthest thing imaginable from a son of heaven. Born into a peasant family so poor that when plague and famine swept through his district in the 1340s, he had no money for coffins, no land to bury his family on with any ceremony, his parents and siblings died, and he could barely provide them a decent grave. He became a wandering monk, then a beggar, eating what he could find, sleeping where shelter offered itself. The bottom of the world was not a metaphor for him, it was the cold ground he slept on. And then he rose. Through a rebel army, through years of fighting, through the particular combination of military talent and political intelligence and ruthless necessity that a civil war produces or destroys, he rose until there were no more men above him. He founded the Ming dynasty in 1368. He ruled it for 30 years. The dynasty he built lasted 276 years after him. The mandate had reached all the way down to the poorest man in the fields, in the hut poorer than the servant we began with, at the very foot of this staircase, and lifted him to the top. This is what the mandate claimed to be able to do, and Zhu Yuanzhang was the most vivid proof it had ever produced. His ritual obligations as emperor included the maintenance of the cosmic alignment between heaven and earth, which meant, among other things, that he alone, of all the people in the empire, could sacrifice to heaven. At the Temple of Heaven, the Tintin, in the southern part of Beijing, the emperor performed this sacrifice at the winter solstice. Proceeding in a great ceremonial procession through the city before dawn, when ordinary subjects were kept indoors so that his path could be pure and uncontaminated by the ordinary life of the streets. He prayed for good harvests. He performed the ritual that, in the cosmological language of the system, kept the grain growing and the seasons turning and the whole human world in right relationship with the order above it. And in spring he went to the sacred field near the palace and ceremonially ploughed the first furrow, turning the earth with his own imperial hands, performing the act that symbolically opened the agricultural year for the entire empire. The peasant in the field below did the same work. But the emperor's furrow was cosmic, his grain was metaphysical. He was not farming, he was performing the rite that made farming possible, the ritual that, in the logic of the mandate, maintained the relationship that kept heaven from withdrawing its approval. Now we reach the top. The Son of Heaven. Tins, the single hinge between the cosmic order above and the human order below, the one man in all the empire authorized to stand where those two orders met. His title, Hunged, Emperor August 3rd, was coined by the first emperor of Qin in 221 BC, when he unified the warring states into a single realm and found that no existing word was adequate for what he had become. He combined two terms from the old mythological histories, the three sovereigns and the five emperors, the great civilizing figures of the legendary past, and from their words made a new one. Hunged, he was claiming, in the title itself, that he surpassed everything that had come before. That whatever the great kings of legend had been, he was more. The symbolic language that surrounded the emperor made his uniqueness visible and enforced it in the bodies of everyone who came near him. The color yellow, a particular rich, warm imperial yellow, belonged to him, not as a preference or a fashion, but as an absolute. To wear that yellow without imperial permission was not a faux pas. It was a kind of treason, a claim to a monopoly that was not yours to claim. The five-clawed dragon, the leng, curling and powerful across robes and porcelain and carved screens. That too was his exclusively. Nobles and princes might display dragons, but their dragons had 4 claws, or 3. Only his had 5. The claw count was a grammar of hierarchy, and to get the grammar wrong, to put 5 claws on a robe that belonged to a 4-claw man, was to say something about rank that the rank did not support. His personal name was taboo. Not merely impolite to say, taboo, structurally forbidden, a prohibition that radiated outward through the entire written and spoken language of the empire. The characters that made up his personal name could not be written in their ordinary form, could not be spoken in their ordinary sound. Scribes and scholars had to find substitutes, archaic variants, workarounds, ways of indicating the concept without deploying the forbidden form. This affected everyone who read or wrote or spoke for as long as his reign lasted. When the dynasty changed, when a new emperor took the throne and imposed his own taboo, the empire's language quietly adjusted itself again. A new set of characters became dangerous, and a new set of substitutes entered use. To approach him required the full performance of the kowtow, the snugu jiku, the 3 kneelings and 9 prostrations, forehead to the floor. Not a bow, not a nod, the full submission of the body to the ground before his presence. This was not an insult. In the language of the court, it was the only appropriate response to the presence of the man in whom heaven's mandate resided. When the British diplomat Lord Macartney arrived in 1793 on an embassy from the British Crown, hoping to negotiate trading concessions, one of the central disputes was whether he would perform the kowtow. He would not, or would not fully, offering a compromise the Qing court found insufficient. The mission returned home without its concessions. The willingness of the body to reach the floor was, in the language of the emperor's world, the difference between a subject and a guest who had not quite understood the room he was standing in. He lived inside the Forbidden City, the Zunchung, the Purple Forbidden City. Built in the early Ming, completed around 1420, expanded and refined over the centuries of the dynasty and the Qing that followed. Around 9,000 rooms within its high vermilion walls, rooms for ceremonies, rooms for administration, rooms for the ranked women of the imperial harem, rooms for the eunuchs who moved through all of them. The whole vast compound arranged on a central axis that ran precisely north to south, because the center of the world required to align with the directions of the world. Ordinary subjects could not enter. The forbidden in its name was not decorative. The walls were real. The gates were guarded. The emperor's world was sealed from the common world by architecture as much as by rank. Inside, the machinery of his daily life was itself an act of governance. He woke before dawn. Audiences were held early, when the sky was still dark, and the officials who had travelled to the capital stood in their ranked order in the outer courtyards, sometimes in winter cold, waiting for the gates to open and the day's business to begin. The emperor sat at the centre, and the memorials came to him, the reports and proposals and petitions and complaints that the bureaucracy generated in enormous quantity, flowing up through the layers of the system to arrive finally at the top. He read. He wrote responses in his own hand, in vermilion ink, the zerp, the vermilion rescript, the red brushwork that only he could produce. That turned a document from a piece of paper into a command. Diligent emperors worked long hours at this. The Yongzheng emperor, who ruled in the early 18th century and is remembered as one of the most relentlessly industrious men ever to hold the throne, annotated documents late into the night, his vermilion comments filling the margins of memorial after memorial, managing the vast machine with a personal attention that exhausted him steadily over the years of his reign. The harem was its own ranked world within his world. The empress sat at its summit. Below her, graded consorts and concubines in tiers of diminishing status and privilege, each with a title, a stipend, a set of apartments of proportionate size, a staff of assigned servants. The system existed to produce and secure an heir, the great biological anxiety at the center of every dynasty, because a dynasty without a clear heir became a dynasty at civil war with itself. The emperor might have many sons, and the question of which one would follow him was never as simple as birth order. There was no consistent rule of primogeniture that all dynasties followed. The first son of the empress was preferred in theory, but theory and political reality were often strangers to each other. The Yongzheng emperor, having watched the brutal succession struggle that had preceded his own accession, his father, the Kangxi emperors, many sons had maneuvered and schemed against each other for years, devised a solution that was elegant in its way. He wrote the name of his chosen heir on a piece of paper. He placed it inside a locked box. The box was placed behind a tablet in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, visible to all, accessible to none. It would be opened only at his death. The empire would not know who the next emperor was until the moment the box was unlocked, the paper unfolded, and the name read aloud. A kind of mystery held at the center of all that power, a secret succession that acknowledged, by the very fact of its secrecy, how dangerous the top of this pyramid was. Because that is the last thing to understand about the man at the summit, the thing that the whole ascent of this staircase has been building toward. For all the yellow, for all the 5 clawed dragons, for all the taboo names and the kowtowing bodies and the 9,000 rooms of the Forbidden City, the emperor was not free. He was constrained by ritual that scheduled his every hour, by precedent that determined how things had to be done because that was how they had always been done, by the enormous weight of the bureaucracy below him, whose collective judgment and collective inertia could not easily be moved, even by an imperial decree. The eunuchs around him controlled what he saw. The Directorate of Ceremonial had its hands on the flow of documents, which meant the emperor's picture of the empire was filtered through the interests of the men who served him. The mandarins who advised him drafted his edicts in language that sometimes said, in its elegant bureaucratic way, something slightly different from what he had intended. His harem produced rivalries that shaped the succession and the factions that formed around each potential heir. The man who was theoretically unlimited was, in practice, a man in a cage of silk and ritual and obligation, and the cage was beautiful, and the cage was real. The mandate had given him everything. The mandate also meant that everything could be taken back. He sacrificed at the Temple of Heaven to maintain the cosmic relationship. He prayed for the harvests. He performed the ceremonial ploughing. He read the memorials and wrote the vermilion responses. He was the pivot of the whole turning world, the one point around which grain and labour and exam and rank and eunuch council and canal water and tribute silk all revolved. The centre that the centre could not hold if he failed in his performance. And if a flood came, if a drought stretched across 3 provinces, if the grain failed and the people starved, and a man somewhere in the south or the north, a man born perhaps in a hut as poor as the servants' courtyard we began with, began winning battles he should not have been able to win. If that happened, the question would form itself in the minds of soldiers and officials and scholars and farmers all across the empire, the same quiet, enormous question. Has the mandate moved? And now we have climbed it. The whole staircase, from the bottom to the top. We sat with the palace maid in her cold courtyard, measuring her days by bells, her world bounded by a single compound she could not leave. We walked beside the farmer carrying his sacks of grain to the collection point, the weight of land tax and corve on his back, the 24 solar terms of the Imperial almanac telling him when to plant and when to rest. We watched the merchant count his silver taels and copper cash strings, rich beyond most men's imagining, and still excluded from the one seat he wanted. We stood outside the 20,000 cells of the Jiangnan Examination Hall at Nanjing and watched men enter with their brushes and their terrified hope and come out either transformed or broken, and occasionally at great old age, still trying. We followed the newly made mandarin to his posting, the embroidered crane on his chest, the ruby button on his cap, the gap between his nominal salary and his actual expenses, already pressing on him before he arrived. We sat in the long corridors of the inner palace where the eunuch moved, quiet and useful, his proximity to power the only currency he had and the only one that mattered. We floated north on the canal boats, holds full of southern rice, the boat households navigating by memory through the flat country between the rushes, carrying the south's harvest toward the granaries where the empire's salaries were stored. We bent our backs with the conscript labourers on the earthworks of the canal and the wall, Yoi. the body debt that made every great project possible and every ordinary life harder. We stood at the altar where the Son of Heaven lit incense before heaven's attention at the winter solstice, maintaining the cosmic relationship on which everything below depended. And we arrived, finally, at the forbidden city, at the vermilion walls and the 9,000 rooms, and the man at the centre, writing his responses in red ink by the light of palace lanterns, caged in ceremony, sustained by the mandate, and always, always aware that the mandate was conditional. The grain in the peasant's sack became the rice measured into the mandarin's salary. The body of the conscript became the wall that protected the dynasty and the canal that fed it. The merchant's son, educated with his father's coin, became the scholar who passed the examination and crossed the threshold into the gentry in a single generation. The eunuch's powerlessness became, by the strange alchemy of proximity, a power the ranked officials could not match. And the whole revolving structure, every transaction in it, every bowl of rice, and every vermilion stroke, and every prostrated forehead, and every sack of grain hauled onto a canal boat, rested on the idea that heaven was watching. And heaven's approval was not a given, and any man at all, born into any courtyard or any paddy field or any beggar's road, might be the one in whom the mandate chose to move next. That is a very old kind of hope, and also a very old kind of accountability. And together they made something that lasted, in one form or another, for more than 2,000 years. If these quiet journeys through the old world give you something to carry into sleep, you are welcome here any night. There is always another staircase to climb, another layer to sit with, another life rendered in the specific texture that makes the past feel less like a story and more like a place. If this one brought you any calm or any gentle wonder, consider leaving a thought in the comments, or a like, or finding the subscribe button so the next journey finds you. It helps more tired minds discover this softer place to land. One sleepy soul at a time. But for now, you have climbed a long staircase tonight, and the view from the top is very still. Let it all settle. Let the grain boats find their moorings in the dark water. Let the mandarin's lamp go out. Let the palace maid's courtyard fall quiet, the bells between the watches silent for a little while. Let the examination cells empty, the brush marks dry on the paper, the candidates sleep. Let your jaw unclench. Let it go completely, that small-held tension. Let your shoulders drop, a little more than you think they need to. Feel your breathing find its own pace, unhurried, the way water finds its level without being told. The crane on the robe is still, the canal is dark and slow. The forbidden city, behind its walls, holds its 9,000 rooms in silence. And somewhere in the logic of a very old world, a boy in a field is looking up at the sky, not knowing yet what he might become, the mandate still unwritten, the staircase still ahead of him. Nothing left to do now but be calm and drift.